This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Jesus was addressing this issue that the people had brought up earlier when they came to him and said, why don't you provide manna for us just as God did? When God provided manna for Israel during the Exodus. They were asking Jesus to prove that he was God. They were looking for a miracle, obviously. They were looking for evidence that he was God. Now, remember, he had just fed the 5,000. They knew what he could do. And earlier, he had helped the man that was by the waters, the crippled man that couldn't walk. He had just told him to get up and walk, and he got up and walked. They'd seen all of that. They knew that he could do these things. But now they wanted this real evidence that he was God, because it was God that provided manna from heaven. Now, what Jesus explained to them was that he was offering something better than manna. Now, most of you don't know this. Some of you do, but most of you don't know. Manna, we've never seen manna since that time, except the closest thing that we have to it is Rice Krispie treats. And so that's the only way I can describe what manna was. It was just this little sweet, little whatever it was that came down from heaven and God provided. It was like a bread. It was like a little sweet bread. And apparently it was bite-sized or something that they were to enjoy, and it would spoil after the day, and so they were supposed to get rid of it. And so it was a miracle. It was obviously something that God had done very, very special for them. And now it's even better because now you can put peanut butter in it, which really makes it good. But back then they didn't have peanut butter. So this manna, they were looking for this manna because that would prove that Jesus was God as far as they were concerned. And Jesus is saying, look, I have something better to offer than manna. Remember, he had just said, I'm the bread of heaven. I'm the bread of life from heaven. To them, that meant manna. And so he's saying, no. I'm offering you something better than what manna did. And he's explaining to them that salvation and forgiveness for sin come at a horrible price. What he said to them, listen, those guys that ate manna, they died. There was nothing special about the manna other than God provided it, but it didn't keep them alive. I'm offering you eternal life. I'm offering you something that is better than what the manna was. And it came and what he's offering them will come at a horrible price. It will come at the price of death. Not the death of a lamb or a bull, but his own personal death. And what he was saying to them was that by his death, by the death of his flesh and by the sacrifice of his blood, he would be able to offer eternal life that would raise them up from death. He said he would do that on verse 54. So they would have eternal life if they partook of what he's offering, the sacrifice that he's offering. And then in verses 55 through 58, he wraps up what he's teaching and he begins to explain it, because right now the Jews, their heads are totally exploding. Their turbans are coming unraveled, they're tearing their shirts. They're really upset about this. And in verse 52, the Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, how can this guy give us his own flesh to eat? That doesn't make any sense at all. So Jesus says to them in verse 53, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Oh, that had to set them off. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you're done for. What? Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. Now, you're having trouble really assimilating this. Can you imagine what the Pharisees and Sadducees were going through, hearing him say something like that? For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, I live because of the Father. So whoever feeds on me, he will also live because of me. In other words, I'm eternal because I'm from the Father. And if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you also will be eternal. Verse 58, this is the bread that came down from heaven, not like the bread the fathers ate, back at the time of the Exodus, and died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. Jesus said these things in the synagogue as he taught at Capernaum. Now, what Jesus was saying, and let's just kind of break this down and analyze what Jesus was saying. What he was saying was that just as food and drink sustain physical life, so Jesus, the real spiritual food and real spiritual drink, sustains his followers spiritually. His flesh and blood give eternal life to those who receive him. His flesh and blood give life to those who receive him. That's what he's saying. My flesh and my blood give life to those who receive him. His spiritual food, what he's saying that he has to offer, his spiritual food is just as real as physical food. And actually even more valuable. So this offer that Jesus is giving to them, here's my flesh and my blood, I'm giving you eternal life through my flesh and my blood, is just really disconcerting to them because they couldn't comprehend it, they couldn't grasp it. And then something really curious happens. Verse 60, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, whoa, this is a hard saying. I mean, who can listen to it? Who can understand this? Who can really grasp this? This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were grumbling about this, he said to them, do you take offense at this? Is this offensive to you guys? Are you really, really upset about this? Is this really bothering you? Actually, what Jesus was saying was, do you have a problem with this truth? That's what he was asking. He wasn't asking if they were all upset because of the idea, eating flesh and blood. Not that. What he was saying is, are you having a problem with this truth? Are you having a problem with what I'm actually saying? And the answer to that is yes. And the answer for you is yes, I am. I'm having trouble really understanding and grasping what this is really saying. Well, see, man's perception of truth is limited by his understanding of the physical. What we define as truth, as human beings, is usually defined by physical experience. For example, we know that something is hot because it's burned us. Or we know that about gravity because we get old. Or we know about seasonal changes. We know about the things that happen because we see the physical evidence of it. We understand truth, and we define, as human beings, we define truth by physical evidence. Name a truth that you believe, I'm talking about in human terms, that you believe that isn't defined by some physical evidence. We define truth as human beings, as people. We define truth by physical evidence. The problem with basing truth on physical reality is that we discover new realities of the physical, and as we discover those new realities of the physical, then our concept of truth must change. Well, how can that be? I mean, if truth is truth, then how can truth change? If truth is truth, then it is always truth. It doesn't change. For example, years ago it was believed that the coldest that water could get was 32 degrees because that was freezing. It couldn't get any colder than that. I mean, you can't have icier ice, in other words. Well, now we know that water could get much colder than that, much, much colder than that. People used to believe that tomatoes were poisonous. Now we know they're not. Trusting physical evidence and building a belief system around that is a very slippery slope. And what Jesus is doing is challenging the people to think beyond the physical evidence. What he's beginning to do is present to them a new reality. That's what he's doing. And he's saying, if you base your concept of truth on physical evidence alone, then you're limiting yourself. Because as your understanding of the physical changes, so will your truth. It's kind of like the old thing. Remember, the earth was flat, and people just kind of, they wouldn't go in the boat too far because they were afraid they'd fall off the edge of the earth. And now we've discovered that the earth isn't flat, and now we go all the way around the earth. As our concept, as our understanding of the physical changed, so did our truth. But God says you need to go beyond that to understand truth. Jesus is challenging his disciples to make a choice about what they believe. He said, I want you to make a choice. Are you going to believe truth on the basis of your physical reality, or is there more? Verse 62 of chapter 6. Then he said, he's just asked the question, does this offend you? In other words, do you have a problem with this? Then verse 62 says, then what if you were to see the Son of Man, referring to himself, ascending to where he was before? What if you saw me just rise up to heaven? What if you saw that? What would you think then? Because, from our understanding of physical evidence is that that's impossible. You can't just float up to heaven. 63, verse 63. It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. Well, yeah, that's true. That makes sense. The flesh contains it, but it's the Spirit that brings life. They understood that. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. I'm giving you two truths here. I'm giving you spiritual truth, and I'm giving you life. But there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew that from the beginning who those were who did not believe and who would betray him. And he said, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father. In other words, you have to be able to believe. There has to be this beckoning in your spirit, a sense of, this is what I want. This is what I need to know. This is what I want for my life. And if there is that beckoning in your life, if there is that sense of calling in your life, I want to know this. I want to know more about that. That's God beckoning you to know Christ. So he said, this is why I told you, no one can come to me unless it's granted him by the Father. And then verse 66, one of the saddest verses in the Bible, and after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. Now, this reference in verses 62 through 63, these two verses that we're looking at here, that refer to the ascension seem a little odd. After all, the disciples at this point had absolutely no clue what he's talking about when he says, well, what if I just rose up to heaven? That's the first time they've ever heard of that. What if I could just fly, in other words? What if I just took off flying? Would you believe that? And what's happening is that Jesus is drawing this line between physical reality and spiritual reality, and then he's teaching the disciples that he, in essence, erases that line. He's saying there is physical evidence and then there is spiritual evidence, and I erase that line. I bring the two together. I draw physical evidence and spiritual evidence together. The disciples, as human, would obviously not think it was possible to see a physical being just ascend up into heaven, just float up into heaven. But Jesus referred to that one event several times. As a matter of fact, in the Gospel of John, he refers to it 6 times, even though, interestingly enough, in the Gospel of John, the story of the ascension doesn't take place. It happens in other Gospels, but not in the Gospel of John. But it's referred to 6 times in the Gospel of John. So this idea of the ascension, Jesus is preparing them, and he's saying, if you see this, would you believe? Would you understand then that that I erase the line between the spiritual evidence and the physical evidence? And that truth then is a combination of those things. This was a key turning point for the disciples. It's a key turning point for you. Jesus was telling them, you're going to cross the line into the spiritual. You are getting ready to cross over from the physical evidence into spiritual evidence. You are going to begin to look at things beyond just the physical evidence and begin to look and see spiritual truth also. You're going to see things and understand things that are beyond the physical world. Listen to what he just said. You're going to see and understand things that are beyond the physical world. And in fact, from the very beginning, Jesus told his disciples that they would experience things that were beyond physical comprehension. When he was calling his disciples, Nathanael was one of the disciples that he called, and in John chapter 1, verse 48, he calls to Nathanael, calls him by name, and Nathanael says, how do you know me? And Jesus answered him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And Nathanael says, Rabbi, he knew who Jesus was a rabbi, was a teacher. He says, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. In other words, Jesus said something to Nathanael that Nathanael knew was impossible for anybody else to know. It would have been impossible from a physical standpoint for anybody to know. Wherever he was, sitting under a tree somewhere, he was in the quiet, there was solitude, nobody else saw him there, nobody knew what was going on. There may have been something that happened under that tree, maybe some thought or something that happened under the tree that Nathanael knew about, nobody else knew about, and Jesus refers to it, and Nathanael is going, whoa, you do know. This is real. You are the Son of God. And Jesus answers him, and he says, look, because I said to you, I saw you under a fig tree, you believe? You will see greater things than these. He was setting that groundwork. He was saying, look, you're going to see spiritual truth that you've never imagined before. You're going to see God do things that just are beyond physical description, beyond physical expression, beyond physical understanding. You're going to assume and realize and embrace a new truth that is not defined by physical evidence. It includes physical evidence, but it goes beyond the physical evidence and includes spiritual truth that defines a new concept of truth. And then verse 66 says that those who could not understand him or who were unwilling to trust him completely withdrew. It was a turning point in their experience. They lacked the spiritual perception to grasp that meaning, what he was saying, what he was teaching. They grasped this understanding that they could believe beyond the physical. They wanted physical evidence. They wanted to see the manna. Show us physical evidence that you are who you say you are. And even though he had already done that, that wasn't enough. They wanted to define what the physical evidence would be. In other words, they wanted to manipulate God. God, it's got to be this way or I'm not going to believe. It's got to be this or no. What happens then is then God becomes your puppet. You know, if you start telling God, okay, God, you got to do this or I won't believe, then God becomes your puppet. What kind of God is that? Because you're going to ask him to do some pretty dumb things. And when you ask for things in your life, have you noticed that half the time the things that you ask for your own life are probably not things you really need or should have? It's just amazing. On the other hand, when God does provide for you and God does give and accomplishes what he wants to in your life, it's amazing how it's beyond your wildest expectations.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.